Sarah Martinez walked into the crowded community center with her head held high, despite the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. At 28, she had learned to ignore the stares and the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when people noticed her approaching. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, she was here to speak at the Veterans Support Meeting, and she knew exactly what kind of reception awaited her. The room was filled with men, mostly in their 40s and 50s, wearing military caps and leather jackets adorned with patches from various deployments. They had weathered faces and calloused hands that spoke of years spent in harsh conditions. When Sarah entered, the conversations didn't just quiet down, they stopped completely. Every eye in the room turned toward her, and she could feel the weight of their skepticism. "You sure you're in the right place, sweetheart?" called out a gruff voice from the back of the room. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive in a way that made Sarah's jaw clench. She had heard variations of this question more times than she could count. The meeting coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Janet, quickly stepped forward. "Everyone, please welcome Sarah Martinez. She's here tonight to share her story with us." Janet's voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if she too wasn't entirely sure what Sarah's story would be. Sarah made her way to the front of the room, her movements deliberate and controlled. She wore a simple black sweater and jeans, nothing that would draw attention to her petite frame or give away any hint of her past. To most people looking at her, she appeared to be just another young woman who had somehow wandered into a veterans meeting by mistake. "Thank you for having me," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere. "I know what you're all thinking. You're looking at me and wondering what I could possibly have to say to a room full of combat veterans." More murmurs spread through the crowd. A man with a gray beard and a Marine Corps tattoo visible on his forearm shook his head slowly. "No offense, miss, but unless you've been downrange, you really don't understand what we go through. This isn't a place for war stories from people who watched it on TV." The comment drew nods of agreement from several others in the room. Sarah could see the doubt written plainly on their faces. To them, she looked like someone who had never faced anything more dangerous than a difficult day at the office. Her smooth complexion and unlined face suggested a life of comfort, far removed from the brutal realities of war. "I understand your skepticism," Sarah replied calmly, "and you're right to be protective of this space. The things you've experienced, the sacrifices you've made, they deserve respect. I'm not here to minimize anyone's service or pretend I understand something I don't." A younger veteran, probably in his early 30s, leaned forward in his chair. "So why are you here then? What's your connection to all this?" Sarah paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the room. She could see the challenge in their faces, the unspoken demand for her to justify her presence among them. These were men who had earned their scars through blood and sweat, who had seen friends die and had carried that weight for years. To them, she was an outsider trying to insert herself into their sacred brotherhood. "I'm here because I've been where you've been," she said simply. "I know what it's like to come home and feel like nobody understands. I know what it's like to wake up in a cold sweat, reliving moments you wish you could forget. I know what it's like to have people look at you and assume they know your story." The room erupted in skeptical laughter. "Come on, lady," someone called out. "Where exactly have you been? The mall food court?" Sarah felt the familiar sting of disbelief, but she had long since learned not to let it show on her face. She had dealt with this reaction countless times, from VA counselors who questioned her claims, from other veterans who refused to believe her service record, from family members who thought she was exaggerating for attention. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan," she said, her voice cutting through the laughter. 2 with the Army, 1 with a Joint Special Operations Unit. I spent 18 months in Helmand Province and another year in Kandahar." The laughter died down, but the skepticism remained. A man with a prosthetic leg visible below his rolled-up pants shook his head. "Look, I don't want to be harsh, but we get a lot of people coming through here claiming things that just aren't true. You don't look like someone who's seen combat. You don't carry yourself like someone who's been in the sandbox." Sarah nodded slowly. She had heard this before. The assumption that trauma always wore the same face, that war always left the same visible marks. "And what exactly should someone who's seen combat look like?" she asked. "Like they've been through hell," the man replied without hesitation. "Like they've got that 1,000-yard stare. Like they've got some weight on their shoulders that civilians just don't carry. No offense, but you look like you could be heading to a yoga class after this." More murmurs of agreement filled the room. Sarah could see that her words alone wouldn't be enough to convince them. She had learned that sometimes actions spoke louder than service records or official documentation. Sometimes the truth required a different kind of proof. "I understand your doubt," she said quietly, "and I respect the fact that you're protective of this community. But I want you to consider something. Maybe the reason I don't look like what you expect is because I've worked very hard to rebuild myself. Maybe the reason I don't carry myself like a broken person is because I refuse to let what happened to me define who I am today." The room fell silent for a moment, but Sarah could still feel the skepticism radiating from every corner. She knew that her words, no matter how sincere, wouldn't be enough to bridge the gap between their expectations and her reality. She would need to show them something more concrete, something that would prove beyond any doubt that she belonged in this room with them. "I know you don't believe me," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "and I don't blame you for that. But before you decide that I don't belong here, before you dismiss my story, I want to show you something that might change your mind." The tension in the room grew thicker as Sarah reached for the bottom hem of her sweater. The veterans watched with a mixture of curiosity and continued skepticism, unsure of what she was about to reveal. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs while others leaned forward, their attention now fully focused on the young woman standing before them. "Ma'am," Janet said nervously from the side of the room, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone here." Sarah paused, her hands still gripping the fabric of her sweater. "Actually, I think I do," she replied softly. "Because until they believe that I've been where they've been, nothing I say will matter, and these men deserve to know that when I talk about coming home changed, I'm not speaking from imagination." Slowly, deliberately, Sarah turned around so her back was facing the room. The conversations that had been rippling through the crowd came to an abrupt halt. Even the skeptics who had been shaking their heads moments before found themselves holding their breath, waiting to see what she would reveal. With careful movements, Sarah lifted her sweater up to her shoulder blades, exposing her back to the room. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the collective intake of breath from 30 grown men who suddenly understood they had been very, very wrong. Sarah's back was a roadmap of violence and survival. Thick, raised scars crisscrossed her skin in a pattern that spoke of shrapnel and explosion. Some scars were long and straight, clearly from surgical procedures. Others were jagged and irregular, the kind that came from metal fragments tearing through flesh. Near her left shoulder blade, a cluster of smaller scars created a constellation of pain that could only have come from being very close to something that exploded. The most striking feature was a large scar that ran from just below her right shoulder blade down to her lower back. Following the curve of her spine, it was wide and puckered, the kind of scar that suggested major surgery and a long, difficult recovery. Around it, smaller scars created a web of healed tissue that told the story of extensive medical intervention. But it wasn't just the scars themselves that stunned the room into silence. It was the realization of what they represented, and the understanding of how wrong their assumptions had been. This young woman, who they had dismissed as someone playing dress-up in their sacred space, carried more physical evidence of combat than many of them combined. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered from the back of the room. Sarah held her position for a long moment, letting the reality of her injuries sink in. She had learned that sometimes shock was necessary to break through preconceived notions. Words could be dismissed, but scars told a story that couldn't be argued with or explained away. Finally, she lowered her sweater and turned back to face the room. The faces looking back at her had completely changed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something between shame and respect. Several men were staring at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. Others looked at her with a new understanding, as if they were seeing her clearly for the first time. The man with the prosthetic leg, who had been one of her harshest critics just minutes before, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. That was wrong of us to assume." Sarah nodded graciously. "You were protecting something important to you. I understand that. But I need you all to understand something. Just because someone doesn't look broken doesn't mean they haven't been shattered and put back together. Just because someone has learned to smile again doesn't mean they've forgotten what made them stop smiling in the first place." A veteran in the front row, a man who had remained silent throughout the earlier exchange, finally spoke up. "What happened to you over there?" Sarah took a deep breath. She had told this story before, but never to a room full of people who had initially refused to believe she belonged among them. IED, she said simply. July 15th, 2019. I was part of a convoy moving through a village outside Kandahar. The locals had been reporting Taliban activity in the area, but our intelligence suggested the road was clear. The room remained perfectly quiet. Every person present understood the weight of those 3 letters, IED, improvised explosive device. The signature weapon of insurgents, responsible for more coalition casualties than any other single cause. It was a threat that every soldier, every Marine, every airman who had served in theater knew intimately. The blast through our vehicle 30 feet, Sarah continued, her voice steady but distant, as if she was seeing the events play out in her mind. I was unconscious for 6 days. When I woke up in Germany, the doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. They said the shrapnel had missed my spine by less than an inch. A little to the left and I would have been paralyzed. A little deeper and I would have bled out before the medics could reach me. She paused, scanning the faces in front of her. She could see the recognition there now, the understanding that came from shared experience. These men knew what it meant to be in a place where death was always just one small mistake, one moment of bad luck away. I spent 8 months in various hospitals, she went on. 17 surgeries to remove shrapnel, repair damage, and rebuild what they could. The doctors did an amazing job, but some things can't be completely fixed. I still have metal fragments in my back that are too close to my spine to remove safely. I set off metal detectors at airports, and I can predict weather changes better than any meteorologist because of how the metal reacts to atmospheric pressure. A few veterans nodded knowingly. Many of them carried their own permanent reminders of their service. Metal plates, artificial joints, and fragments that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. But the physical scars were just the beginning, Sarah said, her voice growing quieter. The real challenge was coming home and trying to figure out how to live in a world that suddenly seemed impossibly fragile. Everything felt dangerous. Loud noises sent me diving for cover. Crowds made me panic. I couldn't sleep because every time I closed my eyes I was back in that vehicle, feeling the world explode around me. The room had become a sacred space now, filled with the kind of understanding that only came from shared trauma. These men recognized the story Sarah was telling because they had lived versions of it themselves. They understood the invisible wounds that often proved more difficult to heal than the physical ones. The man with the gray beard who had questioned Sarah earlier raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how did you end up looking so together? Because when I came back, I was a mess for years. Still am, some days." "You seem like you've got it all figured out," Sarah smiled sadly. "That's exactly the problem with assumptions, isn't it? You're looking at me now in this moment and thinking I have it all together, but you didn't see me 3 years ago when I was living in my parents' basement, afraid to leave the house. You didn't see me when I was drinking myself to sleep every night, because it was the only way to stop the nightmares. You didn't see me when I weighed 95 pounds because the smell of food reminded me of the burning vehicles after the explosion." The room remained silent, but Sarah could see the recognition in their eyes. Every person present had either lived through their own version of that darkness or watched someone they cared about disappear into it. "Recovery isn't a straight line," Sarah continued, "and it doesn't look the same for everyone. Some people wear their struggles on the outside where everyone can see them. Others, like me, learn to build walls so high and so strong that nobody can see the cracks underneath. Neither way is right or wrong. It's just different ways of surviving." A younger veteran near the back of the room spoke up. "So what changed? How did you go from being afraid to leave the house to standing up here talking to a room full of strangers?" Sarah walked over to one of the empty chairs and sat down, making herself level with the rest of the group. The formal presentation was over. Now she was just one veteran talking to others. "It started with admitting that I needed help," she said, "and that was the hardest thing I've ever done, including surviving that explosion. Because asking for help felt like admitting defeat. I had always been the strong one, the one who could handle anything. In the army, I was the soldier other soldiers came to when they needed someone reliable. Coming home and suddenly being unable to function felt like a betrayal of everything I thought I was." Several heads nodded around the room. The struggle between military identity and post-service. Vulnerability was something most veterans understood intimately. My breaking point came when my 8-year-old nephew asked me why I was always sad, Sarah continued. I realized that the person I had become wasn't just hurting me. It was affecting everyone around me. That little boy deserved better than an aunt who jumped every time a car backfired or who couldn't be in the same room with him when he was playing with his toy soldiers because the sound was too much. "So you got help?" asked the man with the prosthetic leg. "I tried to," Sarah replied. "And that's when I ran into the same problem I faced here tonight. Nobody believed me. The first VA counselor I saw took one look at me and suggested I might be experiencing adjustment disorder from my husband's deployment. When I told him I was the one who had been deployed, he actually asked to see my service records because he didn't believe me." Angry murmurs rippled through the room. Every veteran present had dealt with bureaucratic skepticism and dismissive treatment from people who were supposed to help them. The second counselor I saw was better, but she kept focusing on sexual trauma. She couldn't seem to understand that my PTSD wasn't from being assaulted. It was from being blown up. She kept steering our conversations toward topics that had nothing to do with what I was actually struggling with. "That's insane," someone called out from the middle of the room. "How did you finally get the help you needed?" Sarah smiled for the first time since she had started speaking. "I got lucky." The third counselor I tried was a woman named Dr. Patricia Reeves. She was a veteran herself, Navy, served in Desert Storm. The first thing she said to me was, "You look like you've been carrying something heavy for a long time. Want to put it down for a while?" "Finally, someone who got it," the younger veteran said. "Exactly." Dr. Reeves understood that trauma doesn't always announce itself with visible scars. She understood that some of the strongest people are the ones who have learned to hide their pain so well that nobody else can see it. She also understood that being a female veteran in combat brought its own unique challenges. Sarah stood up and began pacing slowly in front of the group. "See, as women in combat roles, we face a double burden. We have to prove ourselves worthy of being there in the first place, which means we can never show weakness or vulnerability. Then when we come home damaged, we face skepticism about whether our service was real enough to justify our trauma." The room had become completely focused on her words. Even the veterans who had been most skeptical initially were now hanging on every sentence. Dr. Reeves helped me understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't affect me. It means learning to carry the weight differently. It means accepting that some parts of me will always be different because of what I experienced, and that's okay. "How long did it take?" asked the man with the gray beard. "I've been working with her for 3 years now," Sarah replied. "Some weeks I see her twice. Some months I don't need to see her at all. But I know she's there when the weight gets too heavy again." "And the physical stuff? The scars and the pain?" Sarah touched her back unconsciously. "The scars will never go away. I still have chronic pain that flares up when the weather changes. I still can't lift heavy things or twist my torso certain ways. But I've learned to see them differently. Instead of reminders of what was taken from me, they're proof of what I survived." A veteran in the front row who had been silent throughout the entire exchange finally spoke. "You said you served 3 tours. Did you go back after the explosion?" Sarah nodded. "I went back 6 months after I was cleared for duty. Everyone thought I was crazy. My doctors, my family, even some of my fellow soldiers. But I needed to finish what I started. I needed to prove to myself that one bad day wasn't going to define the rest of my life." "Weren't you scared?" "Terrified," Sarah admitted without hesitation. "Every single day. But I realized that fear was going to be with me whether I was hiding in my parents' basement or doing the job I had trained for. At least overseas, the fear had a purpose." The admiration in the room was palpable now. These men understood the courage it took to voluntarily return to a place where you had nearly died, to face the very danger that had already proven it could destroy you. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. What had started as a hostile reception had evolved into something approaching reverence. The veterans who had initially questioned Sarah's right to be there were now looking at her with the kind of respect reserved for someone who had not only survived combat, but had found a way to thrive afterward. That third deployment, Sarah continued, settling back into her chair, was both the hardest and the most important thing I've ever done. I was assigned to a forward operating base in Helmand Province, working with a joint special operations unit. My job was intelligence analysis, but in a place like that, everyone fights when they need to. She paused, her eyes distant as she remembered. The first week back was hell. Every helicopter that flew overhead made me flinch. Every time we had incoming mortars, I would freeze for just a second, remembering the feeling of being thrown through the air. My team leader noticed and pulled me aside. "What did he say?" asked the younger veteran. He said, "Martinez, you've got two choices. You can let what happened to you make you weaker, or you can let it make you smarter. Right now, you're still choosing weak." Sarah smiled at the memory. It wasn't the most sensitive approach, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. He was right. I was letting my fear make decisions for me. The man with the prosthetic leg leaned forward. "How did you get past it?" "I started small," Sarah explained. "I focused on doing my job better than anyone else could. I became obsessed with intelligence gathering, with identifying threats before they could hurt my team. I figured if I could prevent other people from going through what I went through, then maybe my experience would mean something. Did it work?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Over the course of that deployment, my analysis helped prevent 12 IED attacks. 12 times we found the bombs before they found us. 12 times soldiers got to go home to their families because I had learned to turn my trauma into hypervigilance that actually served a purpose." The room buzzed with quiet approval. Every veteran there understood the satisfaction that came from successful missions, from knowing that your actions had saved lives. But the real breakthrough came during a night operation about halfway through the deployment. Sarah continued. "We were investigating reports of a high-value target in a compound about 10 kilometers from our base. Intelligence suggested he was planning a major attack on coalition forces." She stood up and began walking slowly around the room as she spoke, making eye contact with different veterans as she passed. "We were moving through a village when our point man spotted suspicious wires along the road. Everyone stopped, and the explosive ordnance disposal team was called in. While we waited, I started analyzing the placement of the wires, the way they were concealed, the materials being used." "You figured out the pattern," someone said. "More than that," Sarah replied. "I realized I was looking at the signature of the same bomb maker who had hit our convoy 2 years earlier. The wire placement, the type of explosive, even the way the trigger mechanism was hidden. It was all identical to the device that had nearly killed me." The room fell silent again. Every person present understood the psychological weight of that moment, coming face to face with the person responsible for your trauma, having the chance to confront the source of your nightmares. "What did you do?" asked the man with the gray beard. "I called in everything I knew," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "I provided detailed intelligence on this bomb maker's methods, his preferred locations, his typical escape routes. We didn't just disarm that one device, we used my knowledge to track him down." "Did you get him?" Sarah smiled grimly. 3 days later, Special Operations Forces raided his safe house. He's still in detention at Guantanamo Bay. More importantly, the bomb-making materials we recovered prevented an estimated 40 to 50 future attacks. The admiration in the room was now mixed with something approaching awe. Sarah had not only survived her trauma, but had turned it into a weapon against the people who had caused it. That was when I realized that my scars weren't just reminders of what I had survived. Sarah continued, "They were proof that I was stronger than the people who tried to break me. Every piece of shrapnel still in my back was evidence that I had faced the worst they could throw at me and lived to fight another day." A veteran near the back of the room raised his hand. "How did that change things for you when you came home for good?" "Everything was different the second time," Sarah admitted. "I came home knowing that I had faced my demons and won. I had turned my worst experience into my greatest strength. That gave me the confidence to seek help without feeling like I was admitting defeat." "And the people who didn't believe you? The counselors and the bureaucrats?" Sarah laughed, but there was no bitterness in it. "I stopped caring about convincing people who were determined not to understand. I found my tribe, people like Dr. Reeves, like the veterans in my support group, like all of you here tonight. The people who matter, who understand what real strength looks like. They don't need proof. They recognize it when they see it." "But you still face skepticism," Janet pointed out from the side of the room. "Like what happened here tonight." "Of course I do," Sarah replied. "And I understand why. We've all been conditioned to think that warriors look a certain way, that trauma manifests in specific, visible ways. People expect veterans to be broken, angry, struggling. When they see someone who has learned to heal and grow, it challenges their assumptions." She walked back to the front of the room and faced the group directly. "But here's what I've learned. Healing is not betrayal. Getting better is not disrespectful to the people who didn't make it home. Building a life after trauma is not the same as pretending the trauma never happened. The veterans in the room were nodding now, many of them recognizing their own struggles in Sarah's words. Several were wiping their eyes, moved by her story and perhaps seeing new possibilities for their own journeys. The truth is, Sarah continued, I work harder at being normal than most people work at anything. I've built systems and routines that help me manage my triggers. I've learned coping strategies that help me function in a world that sometimes still feels dangerous. I've surrounded myself with people who understand that some days are harder than others, and that's okay. What kind of systems? Asked the younger veteran. Simple things mostly, Sarah replied. I always sit with my back to a wall and facing the exit. I avoid crowded places during peak hours. I have a code word with my close friends that means I need to leave immediately. No questions asked. I carry noise-canceling headphones for when the world gets too loud. She paused and looked around the room. But I also have strategies for thriving, not just surviving. I volunteer with organizations that help other veterans. I speak at events like this one. I use my experience to help other people who are struggling with similar challenges. I've turned my pain into purpose. The man with the prosthetic leg who had been one of Sarah's harshest critics slowly stood up. His movement drew everyone's attention, and the room waited to see what he would say. His weathered face showed a mixture of shame and newfound respect. Ma'am, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I owe you more than an apology. We all do. I served 2 tours in Iraq, lost my leg to an IED outside Fallujah in 2007. For the past 15 years, I've been carrying around this anger, this bitterness about people who don't understand what we went through. I've been so focused on protecting our brotherhood that I became someone who pushes away the very people who belong in it. He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. You walked in here tonight and I took one look at you and decided you didn't belong. I didn't see a fellow veteran. I saw someone I thought was trying to steal something that didn't belong to her. I was wrong, and I'm ashamed of that. Sarah walked over to him, her expression gentle but firm. Don't be ashamed, she said. Be better. That's all any of us can do. Recognize our mistakes and choose to do better next time. The man nodded, his eyes glistening. I've got a daughter about your age. She's been wanting to join the military and I've been trying to talk her out of it. Not because I don't think she's capable, but because I've been so focused on all the ways the military can break you that I forgot about all the ways it can make you stronger. Military service changes everyone who goes through it, Sarah agreed. The question isn't whether you'll be different when you come home. It's whether you'll let those changes destroy you or define you in a positive way. Another veteran, a man who had been silent throughout the entire evening, finally spoke up. You said something earlier about female veterans facing unique challenges. Can you talk more about that? Sarah nodded and returned to the front of the room. When women serve in combat roles, we face a constant balancing act. We have to be tough enough to earn respect from our male colleagues, but not so tough that we're seen as threatening or unfeminine. We have to prove ourselves over and over again in ways that men take for granted. She began pacing again, her movements reflecting the energy of someone who had thought deeply about these issues. When we come home with combat-related trauma, people often don't know how to process it. Society has an image of the damaged male warrior. It's a narrative that, while tragic, is at least familiar. But a woman who has seen combat and carries those scars? That challenges people's assumptions about femininity, about protection, about who fights and who gets protected. How does that affect treatment? Asked Janet. In a lot of ways, Sarah replied. First, there's the assumption that any trauma a female veteran experiences must be sexual in nature. Don't get me wrong. Military sexual trauma is a serious issue that affects far too many service members. But it's not the only kind of trauma women can experience in the military. She stopped pacing and faced the group directly. I've had counselors who refused to believe that my nightmares were about explosions and gunfire. They kept pushing me to talk about sexual assault, convinced that must be the real source of my trauma. When I insisted that my PTSD came from combat experiences, they acted like I was in denial. Angry murmurs filled the room. The veterans present understood how damaging it could be to have your actual experiences dismissed or minimized by the very people who were supposed to help you heal. Then, there's the assumption that women aren't really in combat roles, even when they officially are, Sarah continued. People hear that I served in Afghanistan, and they assume I was in a safe administrative position. They can't imagine that a woman might have been kicking down doors, engaging in firefights, or analyzing intelligence that led to direct action missions. But you were doing all of that, the younger veteran said. Absolutely. My job required me to go on patrol with combat units, to be present during raids and operations, to work in forward positions where contact with the enemy was not just possible but likely. But try explaining that to a VA bureaucrat who has already decided that your service couldn't have been real combat. The man with the gray beard shook his head in disgust. That's bureaucratic stupidity at its worst. It gets worse, Sarah said with a bitter laugh. When women do get recognized for combat service, we face a different kind of skepticism. People assume we must have been given special treatment, that the standards were lowered for us, that we didn't really earn our place. They can't accept that a woman might simply be good at her job. So how do you deal with all of that? Asked someone from the back of the room. Sarah smiled, and for the first time all evening it was a genuinely happy expression. You find your people. You find the ones who judge you by your actions, not your appearance. You find the veterans who care more about what you did downrange than what you look like in civilian clothes. She gestured toward the room full of men who had initially dismissed her. Look at this group. 2 hours ago you were ready to throw me out. Now we're having the kind of honest conversation that only happens between people who have shared similar experiences. That transformation is possible, but it requires people to be willing to challenge their assumptions. What advice would you give to other female veterans who are struggling? Janet asked. First, don't let anyone else define your service for you, Sarah said without hesitation. You know what you did. You know what you experienced. You don't need anyone else's validation to know that your service was real and meaningful. She began walking among the chairs again, making eye contact with individual veterans as she spoke. Second, find a support system that understands both parts of your identity as a veteran and your identity as a woman. Those two things don't have to be in conflict, but sometimes it takes work to find people who understand that. And third, prompted the man with the prosthetic leg. Third, don't be afraid to take up space, Sarah said firmly. Don't make yourself smaller to make other people more comfortable. You earned your place in the veteran community. You don't have to hide your strength or downplay your experiences to fit someone else's expectations. The room had become completely absorbed in her words. Even the veterans who had initially been hostile were now leaning forward, engaged in the conversation in a way that suggested genuine respect and interest. I spent too many years trying to prove I belonged, Sarah continued. I wore my pain like a badge because I thought that was what people expected from a real veteran. I was so focused on looking damaged enough to be believed that I forgot to focus on actually healing. When did that change? Asked the younger veteran. When I realized that the opinion of people who refuse to see my strength doesn't matter. When I stopped trying to convince skeptics and started focusing on connecting with people who are ready to listen. When I understood that my value as a veteran isn't determined by how broken I appear to be. Sarah walked back to the front of the room and looked out at the faces that had been transformed over the course of the evening. The truth is, every person in this room has faced skepticism about their service, their trauma, or their recovery. Maybe not for the same reasons I have, but we've all dealt with people who don't understand what we've been through. The meeting was supposed to end at 9 o'clock, but nobody seemed in a hurry to leave. The transformation that had occurred in the room was palpable. What had started as a hostile confrontation had evolved into the kind of deep, meaningful conversation that veterans rarely got to have with people who truly understood their experiences. Before we finish tonight, Sarah said, I want to talk about something that I think is important for all of us to understand. The way you initially reacted to me tonight, that skepticism, that protectiveness of this space, it isn't necessarily wrong. It comes from a real place, a need to protect something sacred. She sat down in one of the chairs, making herself part of the circle rather than standing apart from it. The problem isn't that you were protective of your community. The problem is that you were using the wrong criteria to decide who belongs in it. The man with the prosthetic leg nodded slowly. We were looking at the wrong things. Exactly, Sarah agreed. You were looking at age, gender, appearance, the way someone carries themselves. But those things don't tell you anything about what someone has experienced or what they've overcome. They don't tell you anything about someone's character or their service. A veteran who had been mostly quiet throughout the evening raised his hand. So how do we do better? How do we stay protective of this community without making the mistakes we made tonight? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think it starts with changing the questions we ask. Instead of, "Do you look like what I expect a combat veteran to look like?" we should ask, "What's your story?" Instead of, "Have you suffered enough to earn your place here?" we should ask, "How can we support each other?" "That makes sense," said the younger veteran. "But what about the people who really are lying about their service?" "We all know they exist." "They do exist," Sarah acknowledged. "And it's natural to want to protect against that. But I've learned that stolen valor usually reveals itself pretty quickly when you start asking specific questions about someone's service. People who are lying about their experiences typically can't maintain the deception when pressed for details." She looked around the room, making eye contact with several of the veterans. "More importantly, I've learned that it's better to accidentally include someone who doesn't belong than to exclude someone who does. The damage you do to a real veteran by rejecting them is far greater than any harm that comes from a faker slipping through." The man with the gray beard spoke up. "You've given us a lot to think about tonight, and I want you to know that you've changed how I'm going to approach other veterans going forward. I'm not going to make assumptions based on what someone looks like." "That's all I can ask for," Sarah replied. "But I want to challenge all of you to go further than that. Don't just avoid making negative assumptions. Actively look for the strength in the people you meet. Some of the most powerful stories of survival and resilience come from the most unexpected places." Janet, who had been listening intently from the side of the room, finally spoke up. "Sarah, would you be willing to come back and speak to other groups? I think there are a lot of people who need to hear your story." "Of course," Sarah said without hesitation. "But I want to be clear about something. My story isn't unique because I'm a woman who served in combat. It's not unique because I survived an IED attack. It's not even unique because I've learned to thrive after trauma." She stood up and walked to the center of the circle of chairs. "My story is unique because it's mine, just like each of your stories is unique because it's yours. The details are different, but the themes are the same: service, sacrifice, survival, and the choice to keep going even when it would be easier to give up." "What do you mean?" asked someone from the back. "I mean that every person in this room has a story of overcoming something that seemed impossible. Whether it was surviving combat, adapting to physical disabilities, learning to live with invisible wounds, or simply finding the courage to ask for help, you've all demonstrated the same kind of strength I've had to find." Sarah began moving around the room again, but this time her movements were more relaxed, more conversational. "The man who lost his leg but still comes to these meetings to support other veterans, that takes incredible strength. The young veteran who admits he's struggling with nightmares instead of suffering in silence, that takes courage. The older veteran who's willing to change his mind when presented with new information, that takes wisdom." The room was completely quiet now, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of people who were deeply moved, who were seeing themselves and their experiences in a new light. "When I first started speaking at events like this," Sarah continued, "I thought my job was to prove that I belonged, to convince people that my service was legitimate. But I've learned that's not what this is about. It's about reminding all of us that strength comes in many forms, that healing is possible, and that we're stronger together than we are apart." "How do we stay connected?" asked the younger veteran. "How do we build the kind of community where everyone feels like they belong?" Sarah smiled. "By doing exactly what we've done here tonight. By being willing to challenge our assumptions. By listening to stories that might be different from our own. By recognizing that diversity in our community isn't a threat, it's a strength." The man with the prosthetic leg stood up again. "I want to say something to everyone here. What happened tonight, the way we treated Sarah when she first walked in, that can't happen again. We need to be better than that." Nods and murmurs of agreement filled the room. Several veterans were looking at each other with expressions that suggested they were seeing their fellow group members differently as well. "I'd like to propose something," the man continued. "I think we should invite Sarah to be a regular part of this group. And I think we should make a commitment to approach every new person who walks through that door with curiosity instead of skepticism." The room erupted in enthusiastic agreement. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude and relief. She had walked into this room expecting hostility and had found something much more valuable: genuine acceptance and the beginning of real friendships. "I would be honored to be part of this group," she said, her voice thick with emotion. and I promise you that I'll bring the same honesty and openness to every meeting that I brought here tonight." As the meeting finally began to wind down, veterans started approaching Sarah individually. Some wanted to share their own stories. Others wanted to apologize more personally for their initial reactions. A few asked for advice about family members or friends who were struggling with similar challenges. The man with the gray beard was the last to approach her. "I've been thinking about what you said about your nephew, about how your struggles were affecting the people around you. I think I need to have a conversation with my daughter about her military plans. Not to discourage her, but to make sure I'm supporting her decision instead of letting my own fears hold her back." "That sounds like exactly the right approach," Sarah said. "And if she does decide to serve, she'll have the advantage of a father who understands both the challenges and the opportunities that come with military service." As people began to leave, Janet approached Sarah with a warm smile. "Thank you for tonight. I've been running these meetings for 5 years and I've never seen a group transform the way this one did tonight." "Thank you for giving me the chance to share my story," Sarah replied. "And thank you for creating a space where that transformation could happen." As Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave, she reflected on the evening. She had come expecting to face skepticism and hostility, and she had, but she had also found something she hadn't expected. A group of people who were willing to grow, to change, and to expand their understanding of what it meant to be a veteran. Walking out into the cool night air, Sarah felt a familiar sense of accomplishment. It was the same feeling she had experienced after successful missions overseas. The satisfaction of a job well done, of obstacles overcome, of connections made with people who understood the importance of the work. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Reeves. "How did the meeting go?" Sarah smiled as she typed her response. "They mocked my claim of combat. One look at my back silenced them all. But more importantly, one conversation changed everything.